This is Big Podcast.
Interview format podcasts, they're not working like they used to. Monologue podcasts, it takes a certain bit of skill. It's a lot easier to have a conversation with somebody than to get on the mic and go, go, go. The middle ground, a co-hosted podcast. If you're interested in that, did you hear the last episode? It was a talk with me and Jim Cullison. You might know him from Ask the Podcast Coach. It's a live stream. It happens every Saturday morning, New York time. Podcast.bigpodcast.com. That's where it lives. Go there and check it out now if you're interested. This is Build a Big Podcast, the marketing podcast for podcasters. If you want to grow your podcast audience, have a podcast that makes money, have a podcast that spreads a message, have a podcast that makes impact and that you feel good about and that sounds great, you are in the right place. My name is David Hooper. The website, bigpodcast.com. You know, I wrote a book on this, actually a couple of them. That's all at the website, bigpodcast.com. This episode, the audio edition of my weekly newsletter, that's called Big Podcast Insider. You can find it at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. That goes out every Friday morning, New York City time. And this is what we're going to cover. You plus them equals bigger podcast. The Pacific content opportunity. Your podcast, your rules. The $200,000 podcast. Advocates want legal protections for child influencers. I got a lot to say about this. Also, some classified ads, things that will help you to grow your podcast, make more money with your podcast, and make a podcast that matters, the things that this podcast is about. This episode of Build a Big Podcast is brought to you by Riverside.fm, a virtual studio that makes recording and editing at the highest quality possible, accessible to anyone. Studio quality recordings, lightning fast editing. If you're doing video, up to 4K resolution. You and your guests are recorded locally, bypassing poor or unstable internet connections and giving you studio quality audio and video. One of the things that I love about this is that you can be anywhere in the world. And sometimes people don't really have great internet access, even in the United States. Or even if you do have great internet access, somebody in your house, they get on Netflix and start playing games. Who knows? And you sound like you're underwater. Not with Riverside. That's what that local recording does. You're not going to have any more of those crazy underwater moments. You're also going to get instant transcriptions powered by AI that have 99% accuracy. You can automatically transcribe and capture your recordings in seconds with AI-powered technology. It's accurate, reliable, and it supports more than 100 languages. So whether you're doing something in English, Spanish, Hindi, or any dozens of other languages, Riverside's got you covered. I want you to check it out. You can try it for free. Go to riverside.fm. Take a look at it. Test some of these new features. A lot of cool AI stuff, a lot of stuff to promote your podcast once you are done. Automatic clips, and you're going to be blown away by this. Check it out for free, riverside.fm. If you want to keep going, I've got a discount code for you. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. It's going to get you 15% off for life. URL, riverside.fm. That code to get you 15% off. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. Let's do it. I'm going to go from thing to thing to thing, all of them about podcasting. I do it like a children's audiobook. When I turn the page, you are going to hear this sound. This is issue number 183. All the things that I'm talking about, everything is linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. You plus them equals bigger pockets. I've worked with hundreds of podcasters, and something that I've noticed is how easy it is to get on the content treadmill. In other words, we start to think of our podcast as episodes, let's put that in quotes, rather than who is listening to those episodes. And we start to think who is listening to those episodes as, let's put this in quotes, downloads. How many downloads did you get? We never talk about the people actually listening. Your listeners aren't downloads, they're real people. And you need to bring them into what you're doing for your podcast to be truly successful. I recently went to an event for a small podcast. I'm going to call it a meetup. It's pretty unorganized. They basically let people know where to go and what time to be there. I was just there as an observer. I wanted to see how they did it. There was no special presentation, just a few like-minded people getting together. And they didn't talk about the podcast. They talked about themselves and they listened to each other. They talked about the topic of the podcast, but not the podcast. It wasn't like, have you heard this episode? No. It wasn't like that. It was, let's talk about blank, the topic of the episode. The podcast brought them there, but the event was for them. And that actually brought me into the conversation because I wasn't actually familiar with the podcast. They're talking about topic A. Oh yeah, I got thoughts on that. Yeah. They talked about it, their experiences, how it affected them. It was very, very cool. And this is what happens when people listen to your podcast or any podcast. That's why I'm not mentioning the name of the podcast or the topic of the podcast. Regardless of the topic, Nobody is ever listening for the podcast. They are listening for themselves and how that topic and how what's being discussed affects them. But here's what happens. When these guys left, everybody had a great time. They're going to talk about the podcast that brought them all together. That's how you build an audience. If you want more thoughts on this meetup, if you're wondering about how to do a meetup like this, do it in the city that you are. People don't have to be listeners of the podcast. You can just make it about the topic. Let's say your topic is hamburgers. All right. Do it at McDonald's. I don't know. Do it wherever hamburgers are sold or wherever hamburgers are discussed, because you're going to be discussing hamburgers. Announce it on your podcast. Bring the people you know who are into hamburgers. Let the people whom you've got access to know about this. Tell them to bring their friends. You guys get together. Oh yeah, by the way, you like hamburgers? We've got a podcast on hamburgers. That is audience growth. Start it where you are. It doesn't have to be fancy. Again, McDonald's. I'm not joking about this. It could literally be in the corner of a fast food restaurant, a coffee shop, a park. I've seen these things done a number of ways. It doesn't matter where they are because it's the people that make the event. They don't have to be listeners to your podcast because it's not about you. It's about the topic. Post it on meetup.com, eventbrite.com. Bring people in, have a QR code that goes to a landing page. You know about my landing page? bigpod.net/mobile. bigpod.net/mobile. Steal the landing page. It's a simple mobile-friendly landing page for this podcast, Build a Big Podcast. You are subscribed, right? If not, go there, bigpod.net/mobile, but go there anyway, because I want you to see a simple landing page. You can steal it. Just put your podcast information in there, upload it to your server. And during the event, hey, you like hamburgers? We got a podcast on hamburgers. bigpod.net/mobile or whatever your URL is. That's how you're going to get people in. Yeah, we want to continue this conversation. Okay, you like the event? Let's do it again next month. Bring some friends that aren't here. It's going to take you a minute. It's going to take a bit of work, but not much. You want more thoughts on this? Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Hey, let's talk about Big Podcast AMP. This stands for Audio Monetization Program. It's a personal coaching program, and it's going to help you do three things. 1, grow your podcast audience. 2, get people talking about your podcast. And 3, make more money with your podcast. I've got details at bigpodcast.com/AMP. That's AMP. Again, it stands for Audio Monetization Program. The details at bigpodcast.com/AMP. The Pacific Content Opportunity. Do you know Pacific Content? This was a company in the branded podcast niche. And the branded podcast niche has become increasingly competitive. That's the reason Pacific Content is shutting down. The parent company, Rogers, out of Canada, they're refocusing their efforts on the Canadian audio business. I've seen a lot of thoughts on this over the last, week or two, whenever they announced it. I think it's an opportunity for smaller players in the place. Guys like me, guys like you. You can hire a big company to do your work. And there's some companies that are only going to hire big companies to do their work. Chase Bank, for example, McDonald's. But most companies, they're not putting that much money into their podcasting. They're not putting that much thought into their podcasting. They need somebody to hold their hand. And that's the opportunity for smaller players in the space. You, as a podcaster, podcast producer, you can take a dime and stretch it to $1. You can do a lot with not a lot of money. And because you're a lean, mean machine, you can make a lot. You're going to keep a lot of that money. These companies, not Chase, not McDonald's, but just average companies, the guys that want to get into podcasting, they've got money, but not a ton of money, not Chase Manhattan or McDonald's money. Yet they still need this stuff. It's a lot of money to you. You can do a lot with it. You can keep a lot of it. That's your opportunity because branded podcasts still work. And with fewer larger companies such as Pacific Content fighting for that business, you're going to see a lot of these jobs trickle down to smaller companies, maybe even you. I think this is a huge opportunity. And it doesn't have to be even the mid-level companies. You know where I've seen this work? Real estate agents. These guys love to get in on a local branded podcast and set themselves up to be the guy for a certain city, a certain neighborhood, a certain niche within the neighborhood. A lot of opportunity in branded podcasts. You want to talk about it? Reach out to me via Mastodon, Blue Sky, or Threads. I talked about Big Podcast AMP, the audio monetization program. I talk about branded podcasts with people in there all the time. Bigpodcast.com/AMP if you want more information about that. If you want more thoughts on Pacific Content, I've got it. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 183. Your podcast, your rules. When guests book a remote session with me, they agree to 3 things. 1, they agree to use a quality mic, not a built-in laptop mic. Second thing, they're going to show up from a quiet place, not a McDonald's. All sorts of callbacks in this episode. 3, they understand that even if we do the interview, not all interviews are published. Maybe I'm having a bad day. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe there's technical issues. I can't guarantee that an interview is going to be published, and I want you to know that going ahead when you book a session with me. In addition to those 3 things that they agree to, I also ask for the specific mic that they'll be using, meaning the model. Right now, for example, an RE20 by Electro Voice. That's what I'm using. That's the information I want. That lets me know their level of comfort with the equipment, and it clues me into the pre-interview work that I'm going to have to do with them. If somebody comes to me with an RE20 and they know it's an RE20, I think, okay, that guy probably knows what he is doing when it comes to speaking into a mic. He knows about equipment. He knows how to set it up. He knows how to connect to me. If they say, I don't know, my kid's got a gaming headset, I might have to do a little bit more work. Maybe I'm not going to do it at all. And that is what I want to talk about. It doesn't work for me if somebody is going to come to me and say, computer mic. And that's what happened to me recently. A publicist filled out the form for her client, and she listed the mic model as computer. I suggested a $50 USB mic. This will work for you. And she said, he's not going to do that, sorry. What would you do? I cancel the interview. I'm not going to do the interview, sorry. No, not sorry. I'm not sorry. No, your podcast, your rules. I've got listeners. You're one of them. I care about you. I want to deliver something that's sonically okay. Doesn't have to be great. I'm not going to win any Grammy awards. I'm sure there are audio engineers that are saying, oh man, we need to cut a little bit of this frequency, add a little bit of this, whatever. I mean, you're not going to please everybody, but for the average person, you need to be able to be heard in a car, in a subway, at the gym, compression, man. You do what you can. It doesn't have to be a Grammy award-winning record. Bottom line is this. You get to choose what's right for your podcast. That is who you're going to interview, if you're doing interviews, who you're going to work with, the level of content that you have on your podcast. Maybe you've got expletives. Maybe you don't have expletives. There are reasons for doing both of those things. This podcast, you'll never hear me say the word fuck. Okay. If I do, I'm going to beep it out because I want it to be a family-friendly podcast. Words like fuck are a disconnect to some people. They're also an attractor for other people. Again, your podcast, your rules. Final thought on this as it applies to guests. When you're interviewing a guest, you're basically letting somebody into the house where you and your listeners live. You have no obligation to let somebody in your house who does not live up to your standards and is not going to agree to your rules. And if they do agree to the rules, but show up from a McDonald's with a computer mic, and it sounds like they're calling in from the drive-thru, you've got no obligation to do the interview. I've actually got a funny joke related to this. You can see it at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 183. The $200,000 podcast. This is a great story about the power of focus, and it shows what's possible with a relatively small audience. Sarah Peck of the Startup Parent podcast has generated significant, we're going to get into that, $200,000, significant revenue, despite getting only around 2,000 downloads per episode. This is how she's done it. She's selling high-priced products like an intense leadership incubator, and she targets niche audiences. Not everybody, very specific niche audiences. A significant portion of Sarah's business involves repeat customers. That's another way to do it. You probably heard that. It's much easier to get somebody to buy again from you than it is to find a new customer. Yeah, probably. But you got to deliver on what you promise. And you got to have something just for them, which is exactly what she does. This is the formula. High prices plus repeat customers. Lots of podcasters focus on bigger, put that in quotes, when, put this in quotes too, more focused will get them the same or better results. Is that you? Is it easier to have 1,000 listeners give you $1,000? That's $1 million. Or 20 listeners give you $50,000? Are you focusing on bigger or more focused? You can do either one. It's just a different business model and your approach is different. I'm curious about your market. I'd love to talk to you about it. Mastodon, Blue Sky, or Threads. If you think it's not you, if your market is somehow different than what Sarah's doing, again, I'm on Mastodon, Blue Sky, or Threads. You can get links to all of those. Issue number 183 at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Advocates want legal protections for child influencers. This one hits home for me because working in the entertainment industry for so many years, I've seen firsthand how many kids have been negatively affected by what I consider to be exploitation by their parents. You may be doing this, and I'm not making a judgment, but I think we have to look at who we bring into our stuff. I've got a podcast, for example, and if I had kids on the podcast or even a wife on the podcast, on purpose, accidentally, maybe secretly, like, hey, I'm taping this conversation, whatever, and they don't really understand what they're getting into. Is that being honest? And a lot of times something I see with parents is that they're going for, I guess, easy clicks with photos of the kids, or I was hanging out with my 7-year-old, and they're trying to be the great parent, a more trustworthy person to do business with, somebody who's got it all. This kind of social media success porn that we've all been dragged into. It's a mess. And unfortunately, with social media being so prevalent, we're seeing more and more of this than we used to. Like I said, in the entertainment industry, I've seen it for years. I have seen kids more or less get dragged around by their parents to all these conferences and tryouts. And the kid's like, hey, I want to go outside and play. No, we got to try out, this kind of thing. But these days, you don't even have to be at that level. There's a funny joke. This is one that I should put up visually, actually. But let me tell you, there's two people on a date, and the man is asking the woman what she does. She says, I'm a model on Instagram. And he says, oh, I'm a soldier on Call of Duty. Not to take away from models on Instagram, but it is a completely different business than it used to be. I don't know that I've talked about this on this podcast. I mentioned it in my book. I worked with a booking agent. This is 25 years ago. Victoria's Secret was a client. Abercrombie was a client. I was in Columbus, Ohio, which is where all those guys were headquartered. You had to work to get at that level. And there was a filter. I was one of those filters. Yes or no. I did the voiceover stuff for that company, by the way. I wasn't working actually with the models. I was working with voice talent, but the same thing. We don't have those filters in podcasting either. Anybody can do it. And we also have a bigger reach than we used to. If we put an ad on the radio, if we put an ad on television or an ad in a magazine, circulation 100,000. Okay, cool. That seemed like a lot of people at the time. But nowadays, you could have a quote unquote viral video, whatever that means. 1 million people could see your stuff in a matter of hours. That's how big the reach is. So social media is a thing, and we can drag our kids into it without really knowing what we're getting into, definitely without knowing what they're getting into, and be everywhere by tomorrow. If you've got kids, I would love to hear more about how you work or don't work with them on your podcast and on related media. You can reach out to me. I've talked about Mastodon, Blue Sky, or Threads. If I get enough feedback on this topic, I may put together a complete episode about it. But what do you do as far as boundaries? Specifically what I'm interested in, you could do this with your spouse if you want to, anybody living in your house. What do you do as far as boundaries for the content that you put up and having people participate in that content? Do reach out to me, Mastodon, Blue Sky, or Threads. You can find all those links and also more information about this law, which may go into effect, legal protections for child influencers. This is issue number 183, and you can find it at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Classified ads for you. These are things that will help you to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, have a more professional podcast, make more money with your podcast, have a podcast that makes your mother proud. Podpage, you can join over 25,000 podcasters to automatically create a beautiful listener-friendly podcast site from your RSS feed. Pop the RSS feed in, boom, an instant, beautiful, listener-friendly podcast site. It's the simplest way to create a podcast website. You need your own site for your podcast. You need a home for people to go to. This alone will help you get more listeners. Having that destination page, that subscription page, the episode notes, it's easy, and you can try it for free. I've got it linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Cast Magic automatic episode notes. Over 35,000 podcasters have used Cast Magic to automate episode notes, highlight clips, podcast summaries, blog posts, social media posts, and newsletters. You upload your podcast audio and Cast Magic does the rest. It is very easy to use. You can try it for free. You will find it linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. When you are ready, here's how I can help you even more. If you want the shortcut to building a podcast people care about, Let me give you a couple things for free. One, Big Podcast Extra. I send these out daily. They're short emails to help you build an audience, attract clients, and make money via podcasting. I've got this linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Also linked the Podcast Growth Toolkit. I call it the Swiss Army knife of podcasting. Episode templates, guest agreements, music licensing agreements. These are things that will help you to protect your podcast and make sure that if you do put out an episode, you don't have somebody coming back to you later and saying, could you take that down? I didn't know what I was getting into. All the stuff that I was just talking about with kids and having other people in your house not knowing what they're getting into. This lets them know what they're participating in and protects you, because once it's out on the internet, even if you take it down, it is still there. You will never get it totally down. It's the Podcast Growth Toolkit. It is free. You can get it at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. If you've got a little bit of a budget, I'm talking under $750. This is how inexpensive it is. Big Podcast AMP, the audio monetization program. Personalized coaching for indie podcasters to help you grow your podcast audience and build your authority, brand, and reputation. This is the cheapest way to work with me personally, and I love it. This is something that I've put together specifically for independent podcasters who are on a budget and want that support, not only just of me, but of other Big Podcast AMP members. You do not have to put episodes out that don't sound as good as you know that they could. All these things can be fixed quickly and easily, but you've got to know how to do that. How? I can teach you. Big Podcast AMP audio monetization program. You can find out more at bigpodcast.com/amp, bigpodcast.com/AMP. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Build a Big Podcast. Did you get that last episode with Jim Cullison yet, where I'm talking about co-hosting, how to put together co-hosting agreements, how to make sure you're happy and your co-host is happy, how to make sure that you get quality episodes out in a timely fashion? It's a great episode, and if you're subscribed to this podcast, you'll get automatically. Here's how to subscribe. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. This is actually another page that you should steal. Steal it. Here's the theory. You've got your way of listening to a podcast, an iPhone, an Android device. Maybe you're an old schooler and you like an RSS feed. I've got each of these there for you. One click is all it takes. One click for iPhone, one click for Android, one click for the RSS feed. You can get that co-hosting episode with Jim Cullison and all of the episodes that I put out. I'm here at least once a week. All these episodes of Build a Big Podcast about growing your podcast audience, getting a bigger podcast, making a podcast that people care about, making a podcast that sounds great, and making a podcast that makes impact. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe gets you hooked up. Go there now before you forget. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. And I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.